So for the past 75 years, really since the founding of Israel, and some would say even before, the state of Israel, the government of Israel, could rely on a wealth of goodwill, particularly from its backers, its supporters, many of the states that oversaw its foundation in the 40s, particularly because of the traumatic experience lived by the Jewish people in Europe for centuries. Pogroms, violence, and the culmination of the Holocaust that led to a wealth of legitimate action. And that legitimate action served as a kind of blanket for Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people, violations of international law for decades. It was almost impossible to dent the reputation that Israel had as the legitimate homeland, as the expression of self-determination, kind of coupled Israel with many of the other states that gained their independence and that were decolonized in the post-war period. But over the course of recent years, as the violence has intensified, as the occupation in '67 has led to a kind of centrifuge of settler violence on the borders of the occupied territories, Israel's wealth of legitimate action, its wealth of goodwill and global public opinion has begun to wane. Now, the problem that Israel has now amidst this unfolding genocide in Gaza is that it's stuck in a kind of bind. On the one hand, Israel knows that every single day that new images emerge of children, mothers, weeping, finding bodies under the rubble, these images serve to undermine this idea promoted by the Israel Defense Forces and its government for so many decades that Israel is the most moral army in the world. The government of Israel only engages in acts of self-defense, a myth that was sustained and promoted over so many years through multiple wars in the course of the 20th century. So on the one side, it's stuck in this bind where it knows that these images are so shocking and so disturbing to the international community that they're going to dent what was otherwise a kind of shielded, legally, politically, and diplomatically, shielded politics of expulsion, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing. On the other hand, Israel knows Israel's making a bet that the longer this war goes on in Gaza, that the world will stop paying attention. That if it declares its intention to be in Gaza for over a year, they say this is going to be a long war, that we need to engage not just in a temporary surgical strike against Hamas, but a long-term eradication of Hamas and its roots in Gazan society and Palestinian society. The gamble it's making there is that the global public opinion will tire of this conflict and that it will not recover necessarily its legitimacy in the 20th century sense of being able to paint itself as just yet another movement for self-determination in the style of many of its even Arab neighbors, but one in which people just get tired and move on and cease to pay attention to the systematic violations of human rights, international law, that it plans to sustain both in the occupied West Bank and in Gaza. So this is the present conflict that we have now. Is the international community going to continue to pay attention? Are we going to continue to demand that the International Criminal Court take on the cases of Israeli violations of international law? Are we going to need to pressure our governments to either sever ties with diplomatic relations or recall our ambassadors? Are we going to march in our millions in the streets of London and Paris and Sao Paulo? Or are we going to tire, move on to the next thing, prove this conflict to be yet another casualty of the increasingly short attention span of the global community, thereby enabling Israel to basically not operate necessarily under the cover of darkness, but under the cover of complacency of the international community. To make sense of the West's relationship to Israel, and in particular to Israel's unfolding campaign of genocide in Gaza, and of course sustained violence both of a settler and military variety in the West Bank, it's critical to make sense of where the West is now. Which is to say that for decades, the West has delivered a blank check, a diplomatic blank check to Israel to conduct whatever it wants. We are so far from any paradigm of accountability, let alone justice, for what's happening in Israel, that it's tough to see where the West goes from here. Let's start with the United States, my country of origin. This is a country where the House of Representatives is voting unanimously to codify anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. that criticizing Israel is going to be perceived at the highest levels of US politics as an insult to the Jewish people. That's how far behind we are, where any conversation about qualifying, conditioning aid to Israel is considered to be an offense against the Israeli state and therefore an offense against the Jewish people. The US is a country where AIPAC, so the peak Zionist lobby organizations, are spending not $1 million, not $2 million, not $10 million, but hundreds of millions of dollars every few years, every campaign cycle to unseat not opponents, but critics of Israel, and to make sure that incoming senators and congresspeople, no matter if they label themselves progressives or conservatives, if they come from the left or they come from the right, are completely silent on the question of Palestinian suffering and give full force, full endorsement to Israel's violence, settler violence, or expansionary irredentist violence in Israel. And so understanding how far we are in terms of the West's relationship or complicity in the present campaign of violence, I think has to inform our understanding of where we go from here, where the world goes from here. Because I don't think it's reasonable, no matter what Macron is saying at COP. I think Macron is a politician that responds to the pulse of the international community. And I was saying before, the pulse of the international community, of the mass majority of people around the world, is utter horror, utter terror, seeing these images come out of Gaza. But the question is how that impulse, how that sort of rhetorical gift that Macron is giving from the podium to the international community, how that rhetorical gesture translates into meaningful policy action. And on that, whether we're looking at Ursula von der Leyen, or we're looking at Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom, or we're looking at President Joe Biden, I'm not very hopeful that we're going to see a small, let alone a sea change in the policy vis-a-vis Israel, which is why the moves of global South nations, of the G77, of countries like Pakistan, are so critical to give voice to that global consensus and to ensure that the system of multilateral institutions that has been built to defend human rights, to defend self-determination, to defend the UN Charter, that doesn't go, ignored and left to wither on the basis of Israel's pronunciation of its constant and permanent state of exception vis-a-vis those institutions, vis-a-vis the laws that are supposed to govern the international community. I said at the beginning of the segment that there's a tension in terms of Israel's determination to engage in some of the most vile forms of ethnic cleansing and violence in Gaza, the tension between the determination to commit that violence and the fear and anxiety that international public opinion will turn away from it. I think that bestows a responsibility not just on governments in the West, who of course have been the authors, the sponsors of Israel's formation and subsequent expansion since 1948 and before, but it bestows responsibility on the peoples of the world, not just to stay angry, not just to stay engaged, but to think critically about what are the nodes of complicity that bind all of us to the state of Israel. I think a lot about the trade unions who are producing armaments that will go into bombs or airplanes or helicopters or guns for the Israeli government. There is a whole network, a whole infrastructure of complicity that binds all of us in our respective communities to this project, this genocidal project of Zionist expansionism. And so I think it bestows this unfolding genocide in Gaza really bestows a responsibility for us all to get really critical about what is that network, what is that architecture, what is that infrastructure of complicity, to think about what kind of sand we hold in our hands to throw in the gears of that war machine. I think it's all too easy to throw up our hands in frustration or resignation about how our governments are acting, or more importantly, failing to act on this question. But it's going to be a much more challenging, much more interesting, much more promising project of making the solidarity that's emerging on the streets of the world, to turn that solidarity into more than a slogan, into a kind of political action. I think that option's available to all of us. That option's available to people who are waking up and going to their jobs in factories and warehouses and companies across the world. And it's time that we realize the power that we each and every one of us have in those respective communities to make a difference in this conflict, as opposed to sighing or exclaiming on the absence of sufficient international action at the level of the multilateral system to deliver justice for the Palestinian people.